Would you say that you generally trust people? Would you say that that's generally a good idea? Let's stick around and discuss that today on The Buyer's Mind.
Welcome to The Buyer's Mind, where we take a closer look deep inside your customer's decision-making mechanism to reverse engineer the perfect sales presentation. Now, please welcome your host, Jeff Shore.
Welcome, everyone, to The Buyer's Mind, where we investigate exactly what's going on in the brains of prospects who are considering a purchase decision. That's what this podcast is all about. It's about taking a stroll through the mind of the buyer. It's about knowing the customer so well that sale begins to roll out right in front of you. We go with the idea that if you know your customer very, very well, you can reverse engineer your sales presentation, because after all, our job is to make it easy for people to buy. And welcome also to our show producer, Paul Murphy. Murph, how's it going today?
Hey, it's going great. How are you doing, Jeff?
Good. We're going to be talking about trust today, and that's something, of course, we talk about a lot here at Shore Consulting. I like to think that it's a part of our culture. Do you go into that idea, Murph? Do you think with the whole concept that there is such a thing of trust that permeates an entire culture of an organization?
I think there is. When you think about, you go in shopping, you buy things at places where you know it's going to be reliable. You know that they're going to back up what they say, so you trust them. I think of, specific car brands. You like Infiniti. I like Infiniti. Why? Because they build a solid product, and so I have trust in what it is that they build.
Absolutely. It is very important when we look at that. We give people our trust, and then we sort of put them to a test. Ernest Hemingway once said, the best way to find out if you can trust somebody is to trust them. And we're going to hear from our guest, Dr. Monica Capra, in a little while about how volatile that trust is, what we can do to build trust, and how it can be easily taken from us if we're not careful. We always start our podcast with a quote. And boy, when it comes to quotes about trust, I could be here all day long. I could look at Zig Ziglar saying, if people like you, they'll listen to you. But if they trust you, they'll do business with you. Or I can look at Albert Einstein, who said, whoever is careless with the truth in small matters cannot be trusted with important matters. And these are both very relevant to what we do even in the sales world. But I love this one by Stephen Covey. He says, trust is the glue of life. It's the most essential ingredient in effective communication. It's the foundational principle that holds all relationships. And certainly that holds true to the relationship between a salesperson and a customer. That trust has to be there. And the trust has to be there both ways. But there's no question about it. That trust is something that is not assumed. It is something that is earned. But when we do that right, it makes all the difference in the world. And so when we think along those lines, we start thinking about what we do to try and build trust. How do we build trust? And it's interesting that we can spend a lot of time building trust. It doesn't take very much to destroy that trust. And if you look at the quote from Friedrich Nietzsche on this, he says, I'm not upset that you lied to me. I'm upset that from now on, I can't believe you. And that's a very, very powerful way to look at this thing called trust. So we're going to get into it today and look at what trust is and how so much is at stake with the idea of trust. Now, before we do that, we'll take a moment to let you know that the podcast is brought to you by Home Street Bank. That is our show sponsor. That's also my lender. I used Home Street in my last purchase, and it was fantastic. Great people, great service, great rates. If you're a real estate professional, you want to use these guys because they'll take really good care of your client. Banking, home loans, credit lines, you name it. Go to homestreetbank.com to learn more. That's homestreetbank.com. Let me give you our sales tip of the day. I've talked in the past about the connection between being nice and then being likable and then being trustworthy and then being influential. And those things happen sequentially. When I am very nice to someone, then I am perceived as being likable. When I'm perceived as being likable, I'm perceived as being trustworthy, and that puts me in a position of influence. Influence to do what? Influencing people to do that which is in their best interest. So it all traces back to to that kindness, that being nice, which I know sounds like sort of, pithy, trite advice, but it really does make a huge difference in the perception of the person that you are going to be talking to. So let me make the suggestion to you. When you're going to meet somebody for the very, very first time, I want you to think facial posture. Think about facial posture. Think about the lift to the face. The face does something really, really interesting. It displays your level of energy. And we see people who have a low energy face, and they're not people that we find engaging or endearing that we really want to do business with. But when we're thinking about just the lift to the face, about that facial posture, it makes a huge difference. But the key here is to think about facial posture before you turn the corner, before you walk into an office, before they walk into your office. Think about that facial posture. And even if you're doing your work on the telephone, that facial posture can make a huge difference. It lets people know, I am here, I am present, I am into this, and this is going to be an enjoyable encounter. Before we get to our interview, I want to tell you about an opportunity here, and that's to be involved in our 4-2 Academy. Our 4-2 Formula Academy, this is an intensive training program specifically for real estate sales professionals, where we're using modern selling strategies and skills just for today's buyers, just for today's market. The 4-2 formula is the core real estate principle that we talk about at Shore Consulting, but it's going to give you several days and actually spread out over the course of an entire quarter, a program that'll allow you to just transform your presentation. We've put so many people through the 4-2 Formula Academy, always with tremendous results. You can go to jeffshore.com/events to learn more about the 4-2 Formula Academy. Well, I'm thrilled to have on the Buyer's Mind Dr. Monica Capra from the Claremont Graduate School, and she does some amazing work in the area of behavioral economics, in the area of neuroeconomics, and I think you're going to find a fascinating conversation as we talk about trust and what trust is and how we define that. So welcome to the show, Monica. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Let me start here. How do you describe what you do to people that you meet at cocktail parties? I mean, you live your life in the academic world much of the time, but how do you narrow that down to people who may not fully understand what you do for a living?
Well, when I talk about trust to people who I just meet, I tell them that it's one of the most important values that can hold our society and our economy together. Actually, for every single transaction, business transaction, there has to be trust. And in economics, we teach our students that, in order to have a business transaction, you need to have a contract. But there is no contract that can be complete, that can take into account every single contingency. So no matter what, trust is needed in a business transaction. It's needed to build partnerships. Mm-hmm. And so it's one of those things that it's important to build in order to be able to have a better society and an economy that works better.
How did you start? What got you interested in this subject of trust? Because one of the things that I look at is it's such a big topic. Where do you even start to get your hands around a topic as big as trust?
Oh, this is so interesting, actually. Once I was coming back from a conference in Houston. On the plane, I was sitting next to a Nigerian executive who had been in Houston for a business meeting. Mm-hmm. And we start talking about some of the struggles that some countries in Africa were having. And being an economist, I said, hey, trade is important to reduce conflict and war, because when you are trading, you really don't have to take up somebody else's resources or things like that. So there's no need to fight. And so I said, have you all thought about trying to promote trade among countries so that reduces conflict, and even within localities in a country? And he looked at me and he looked into my eyes and said, of course, but guess what? People don't trust each other. So, and then I'm like, wait a second, of course. I mean, in order to, as I mentioned before, transactions require trust. And sometimes we don't even think about it. We're not like, oh, do I trust the individual or not? It's kind of like hardwired into our some people are more trusting than others. When you are in a place or are in a situation where there is no trust, you will notice it because you might be less willing to engage in a transaction, in a partnership, and in economic activity.
When you say that you notice it, how much of that is conscious? How much of that is non-conscious? Is it, we talk about the debate over how much there is such a thing as intuition. How much of this do you think, when I'm noticing a lack of trust or the presence of trust, how much of that is conscious? How much of that is non-conscious?
Yeah, that's a good question. Some people have a tendency to be more trusting than others. But generally speaking, trusting individuals tend to be females, tend to be religious. So there are some observable characteristics of people who are more likely to be trusting. And I don't think that's something people are aware of. It's something that is kind of hardwired into an individual's personality. But that said, given that personality, there are different contexts in which you might behave more trusting than others. So, for example, people are not completely naive, right? So they are going to, before trusting a business or engaging into business transaction, they might look at the reputation of the individual. So trustworthiness generates trust. And also other things such as status and popularity. These are things that people look at consciously before trusting. So there is an element of hardwired trusting tendencies that are kind of related to people's observable characteristics, as I mentioned, gender. And also, there are some conscious elements of it that people will observe the environment and then look at the relevant information and decide whether to trust or not.
Is there research that backs up why women tend to be more trusting than men?
That's a good question. There's some people who argue that oxytocin is actually a hormone that is considered the trust hormone. So if you are bonding with your children, as a mother, it's believed that oxytocin is the mediator of that social bond. And so it turns out that, oxytocin may be the reason why females tend to be more trusting than males. But in general, it could be a hormonal thing. And that's kind of the state of the knowledge right now. But again, as we all know in science, it's kind of a never-ending dynamic study. And so that might be a reason. Trust is considered one of our social preferences that economists study. And in general, women tend to be more kind of social than males. So maybe there is an element of that as well.
What about ethnic groups? Is there research or have you studied this empirically in regards to the trustworthiness of a culture? You were originally from Bolivia, for example, but you've traveled all over the world. You've certainly worked with people from all over the world. Can you trace that back to cultural norms and the amount of trust that is ingrained even from a young age, according to what's taught by society?
This is one of the questions that social scientists have been trying to determine, whether there are societies that are more trusting and trustworthy than others. There have been some studies that show that ethno-linguistic fragmentation, that is, societies that have many different tribes, like my own, Bolivia has many indigenous tribes, and there are at least 4 official languages. And so societies like that, they're not as trusting as societies that are homogeneous. So there is this evidence that ethno-linguistic fragmentation is correlated with lack of trust.
We've certainly seen this because of the audience is largely that we're listening to is sales and marketing focused. We see even from different ethnic groups, at least anecdotally, there are some that you can just tell right from the very beginning. It's going to take a little longer to establish that trust. But I'm assuming that your counsel would be, don't assume that the trust exists in the first place. It still has to be something that's earned. Exactly.
It has to be earned. And if the people tend to trust institutions or other individuals who have a reputation. So let's give the example of information or news. Like today, we are living reality of fake news. So how do we know? My children ask me this all the time. How do we know if this news is fake or not? Mm-hmm. And sometimes, well, I tell them they think to be critical, they have to look at evidence, read many different sources. But at the end of the day, sometimes you just rely on the source of the news, right? So that's the importance of reputation to make people trust. So, but if individuals are, let's say, interested in starting a business abroad, they might not have reputation in that place or different community. So that's a little bit more difficult to establish, trust. And one possibility that is based on study that I have done with some colleagues is to establish kind of set status, like, for example, individuals who have many different credentials, good credentials and prices or something like that, maybe consider more trustworthy. I have a study where we get our subjects to make financial decisions, and then they get advice from an expert, quote unquote expert. And it's interesting how more likely they are to trust and follow the advice of the expert. So status seems to be also something that can help individuals gain trust from others.
When we look at the idea, because you once wrote that the main determinant of trust is trustworthiness, and obviously that ties into what you were just talking about in regards to reputation. There's a strike against then salespeople, because oftentimes the reputation for salespeople as a profession is oftentimes negative. It's biased against a salesperson. So that sales professional might be, kind and practices strong ethics, a lot of integrity, and yet that customer might walk through the door with a bias against salespeople. It's an uphill battle at that point. What does a salesperson do in order to increase trust at a time when a customer might otherwise say, you're a salesperson and therefore I don't trust you?
Yeah, that's a good point. So one really important thing is to be able to connect with the customer. And that can happen through listening what their concerns are, and also informing people about providing information. So as I mentioned before, sometimes it's hard for people to know exactly whether the information that is being given is truthful. Mm-hmm. Let's give an example. So one of my friends, he sells dietary supplements, mm-hmm. and he's a sales individual. He goes to different potential customers. And as that's a complicated product, because the customer cannot immediately verify whether the claims of the usefulness of these dietary supplements are true. It takes a while for the supplements to be consumed before you might see a benefit. So one thing that he does that is very effective is first listen to the concerns, and then provide information. And the information includes both potential benefits and things that are not known and potential negatives. So it's kind of like transparency that tends to help. Once the salesperson has listened to me, there's no reason why I shouldn't listen too. So in the sales individual, they want to kind of generate that prosociality. Like as we mentioned, this feeling of prosocial feelings or preferences tend to be correlated with more trust. So you want to generate that in your business, try to get people to feel comfortable. One
of the things that I find interesting is, Dr. Robert Cialdini, in his book on influence theory, talks about likability as one of the 6 key influence principles that he points out. And it does seem like there's this connection that says if I'm very kind, if I'm intentionally nice right from the very beginning, I am likable. And if I am likable, I am therefore trustworthy. It seems to sort of jump in. Now, that in some ways doesn't even seem like it should make sense, right? Because there's there is not necessarily a direct correlation between likable and being trustworthy. And yet, if you look at, say, a con man who's trying to rip you off, that's exactly their method, right? They're very nice and therefore they're likable. And then we assign trust to people that we like, even sometimes against logic. What is the connection between likability and trust?
Yes. So, it's strongly connected. So there are some studies that the Alexander Todorov and his team have done on the right face to have to generate more trust, right? So the people who are liked based on their facial figures then they tend to be trusted more. So people who have the right voice tend to be trusted more, and people who, to seem nice, even if they are not doing anything that suggests that they are nice, they just seem nice. Mm-hmm. They have the right face, the right voice, the right way of walking, whatever. They are trusted immediately. So there is a correlation between trust and likability. But that said, it all depends on how costly it is for people to trust. So trust is defined as, the tendency to put yourself in a vulnerable position with no commitment from the other to actually not be opportunistic. So if let's say if I invest in a venture or if I leave my dogs with a friend, I'm trusting that my investment is not going to be taken away, or my dog is not going to be, starved or not walked or something like that. So it depends on how costly it is to put yourself into that vulnerable position. So many people are going to look at, if it's an investment decision that is costly enough, I might say, wait a second, that person seems nice, but let's look at ask tough questions. What does the individual know what they're selling? Are they aware of the negative and positive aspects of the product? Do they seem to have my interest, taking my interest into account? And so I think that people are sophisticated. So we have this tendency to trust people that are likable and they have the right face, the right voice, but then we don't stop there. We think a little bit deeper.
We're talking to Professor Monica Capra on the subject of trust. And Monica, I'd like to ask you here, this is so fascinating. I'd like to ask you about your journey just a little bit, because you study this all day long. And, for me, my expertise is sales, the sales transaction, the sales conversation. So when I am in the position to shop for something or if I want to buy something, I am extremely critical of what it is that I'm watching. I have a very attentive eye for such things. But I assume that you're doing the same thing when you're out there shopping for, a car or a piece of jewelry or a home or whatever it is. How cognizant are you of how much you are trusting that person? Or even for somebody like you who studies this all the time, does it just happen so much in the non-conscious that's either happening or not happening? How much are you aware of your need for trust in the middle of a transaction?
Oh, that's an interesting thing, because I study these things, but it's really difficult for me, because I understand, like I teach, I used to teach a course that covered negotiation too. Mm-hmm. And when I am in these real life situations, I see them as from the point of view of a scientist. I study them, but for my own kind of experience, I don't know. I mean, I think I trust a lot. I don't ask the right questions.
But I think what you're saying is it speaks to how powerful trust is, that even for somebody like you who studies it all day long, it's almost impossible to step aside and look at it completely objectively, because internally it's the trust is almost a controlling factor for you. Am I overstating that?
No, you are not. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what happens. I mean, I experience that all the time. I talk to my husband sometimes when we purchase the car. I'm like, whoa, we spent like 4 or 5 hours there at the car dealer, and that guy is sweet on us, and I kind of like him, and I mean, I don't know if I really had a good deal or not. I mean, it's interesting. Yeah. So there is an element of art in all this that goes away from, I mean, doesn't enter the radar of rationality and science.
Yeah. Does that surprise you, though, in your everyday life? I mean, you wrote, and I'm just going to quote it here, trust is so intertwined in our everyday lives that it is often unacknowledged. It is only when trust erodes that we can appreciate its significance. And when I read that, I was thinking to myself, when I'm driving down the road, there is, there's a yellow line that separates the direction I'm driving from the direction the other person is driving, and that's it. I mean, the amount of trust that I put in a complete stranger to stay on his or her side of the line, if I look at it today, I go, it almost seems highly irrational that I should trust a complete stranger that much to do their job and to stay in their lanes. It seems to me I should be scared to death, and yet there is an assumption of trust that takes place, and as you say, it only erodes, only when it erodes do we appreciate its significance.
Exactly. I really liked what he just said. I mean, suppose an individual is going through surgery. I mean, you are trusting scientific knowledge that the procedure that you're going to get is actually the right procedure. You're trusting the doctors, the surgeons who are going to cut your body. Mm-hmm. You're trusting the nurse. You're trusting your insurance company. You're trusting the hospital. You're trusting the laws of your nation that rule how all these groups interact with each other. I mean, it's super important. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people, I guess because I'm from a developing country too, this trust is, as I mentioned, there is a correlation between, I don't know if I mentioned, but there's a correlation between levels of trust, society level of trust, and GDP and investment. So at the kind of global level. So if you, in some countries, I mean, these things that you take for granted that, I don't want to cross the red line. Some places, people do cross the red line. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or the yellow line. I mean, that happens. And then you're like, what's going on? And it takes a while to adjust. But it's amazing how it sounds that it will be something easy to change, but it's not, because it requires, it's just there's so many pieces that are connected that need to change.
Is there a connection here between the level of trust that I might carry in my everyday life and my everyday interactions, even with the clerk at the store, or as I say, with drivers around me, and how I feel about trust on a macro level? Here I am living in the United States in a really interesting day when many people are showing a profound distrust for the government around them, for big business, athletes, all of these things, the media, all of these things that we would say are important in our lives, and yet there seems to be, and maybe I'm overstating this, I don't know, but there seems to be a large amount of distrust for those institutions. Does that sometimes drip down into my day-to-day interactions? And in other words, how much do I connect a macro trust with micro trust?
That's an excellent question, and I'm not aware of any systematic study of that. But there are different ways you can measure micro trust. One is, basically doing experiments that you get a group of people to voluntarily place resources at the disposal of an anonymous individual who can come from the same community or a different community. And then the trustee has to decide whether to return the investment to be more than reciprocal, so return the investment plus, or to just walk away with the money. Mm-hmm. And so these are called investment games that are used to measure trust, as defined as an action of placing resources at the disposal of a trustee. Mm-hmm. These games have been done in many, many different countries, and there seems to be a correlation between lower levels of trust and at the micro level and the kind of aggregate level. So, but there's also evidence that that some groups that are very trusting also are within countries that have very low institutional levels of trust. So there are two kinds of trust, interpersonal and then institutional. So the World Value Surveys, they ask people how much they trust their institutions, like the military, like the church or religious institutions, and the Congress and the presidency and stuff like that. And so most of institutions in democratic societies tend to score very low in terms of trust. Church and religious institutions tend to score higher, as well as the military. So that's kind of some of the trends worldwide.
Interesting. So there's not the definitive study on macro trust versus micro trust, but because you are such a prolific researcher and writer, if that ever shows up in one of your titles, I'll expect my name to be in the citation list.
Absolutely. Okay. This is a really important question. That said, I mean, academia is so dynamic now that perhaps there is papers that I'm not aware of that have popped up.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Just one last question. This has been just a fantastic conversation, so fascinating. If you wanted to look at it as sort of, well, let's go this way. How would you instruct your children on how they might be considered trustworthy? I think that's a good way to approach it for everybody. We all want to be trusted. We always want to be trustworthy people. So how would you instruct your children along those lines?
Yeah. So one thing to emphasize is that the value of reciprocity is quite important. If somebody does something for you, you have to kind of pay it back. And it's best to be prosocial or nice or cooperative, not wait for the other to do that, but do it before the others do. So I think telling my children the importance of reciprocity, the importance of being kind to others, and also building up a good reputation of being excellent at everything that they can do. I give their best. That's something that I think will make them more trustworthy. Yeah, my kids are really nice. Sometimes I think they should try to be as nice. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, we could maybe learn more from them than they can learn from us at times. Fantastic. Professor Monica Capra, Professor of Economics at Claremont Graduate University. Fantastic, insightful, and very, very helpful conversation. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
All right. Boy, I'll tell you what, Murph, I don't know about you, but I trusted Monica. She just was really trustworthy soul, didn't you think?
Such a pleasant voice, a smile in her voice. I mean, I think that always helps when somebody has a smile in their voice, helps you to trust them a little bit more. Yeah,
because it was interesting. She touched on the idea of work that was done by Alexander Todorov, faces with high inner eyebrows, pronounced cheekbones, a wide chin struck out as trustworthy. And I look and I go, I don't think I have any of those things. Maybe I'm just the opposite. But when it really comes down to it, those might be on the surface, but you sort of get the sense, and we got this from talking to Monica, is that there's a part of your soul that you're trusting much more than your face that you're trusting, right?
Well, it's interesting, the hormones that play a role in it, right? Oxytocin is one of those things that connects us to people.
Right.
It's one of it's sometimes referred to as the love hormone. But it's interesting that that's something that kicks off inside of our bodies. And we've talked about that in the past on some of the shows, about the fact that our brain chemistry is a dead giveaway to whether or not we are going to connect.
Scott Halford had talked about that back on episode 1 of The Buyer's Mind, and it seems to be consistent in regards to trust. I also love the concept that the main determinant of trust is trustworthiness. business that's largely based on your reputation, but it's also based on the idea of, just dang it, do what you say you're going to do, and maybe even a little bit more. And for salespeople, it's always good advice anyway, but not just to provide good service, but to increase the level of trust. Because for salespeople, as I had mentioned to Monica, and I assume you feel the same way, Murph, right? That you walk into a sales situation as a consumer, and you kind of got one eyebrow raised, and you're almost wondering right from the very beginning, who is this person? Can I trust them?
We've talked about that in the past. Just I go in with a little bit of a skepticism whether or not this person is going to earn my trust. And if they're talking about their product and they're pushing their product, I tend to be even more skeptical because they're not finding out about who I am and what it is that I need.
Sure. Yeah, right. So they'll validate then the fears that you had when you walked through the door. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, here's my big thing, and if I could turn this into some advice for all of our listeners, I would go in this direction. Professor Capra talked about these two levels of trust: institutional trust and interpersonal trust. And we were talking about it into the understanding of institutional trust being along the lines of, governments or religious organizations or the military, those types of things. But there is the institution called sales. So your customer's looking at it, especially for those customers that you've not met before. There's this institution called salespeople that may or may not be positive in their eyes, but there is an interpersonal level of trust that belies that. And my point here and my instruction to all of you would be to look at it and say, even if your customer is coming through the door with a negative spin, a negative take on the institution called sales, there's a whole nother level of trust called interpersonal trust, and that you can control. And you can control it 100%. So if a customer brings in a negative degree of trust over the institution of sales, we can outlast them. We can prove to them, I do not belong in that bucket. And that's what goes to that idea of that kindness, that niceness leads to likability, that likability leads to trust. And it was confirmed by Dr. Capra right here. There's no question the distinction is very, very strong. If I can show them my best self, my kindest self, then what's going to happen? There's a likability that will lead to trust. And we can overcome that institutional distrust that we often see in sales. Because even for you, if you're listening right now and you carry some of that distrust when you walk into some sales environments, what will you find? You're going to find that if you look at it, for example, say, oh, used cars. Yeah, until you walk into a dealership and you meet a really great, honest, kind, seemingly trustworthy salesperson, and you look and you go, okay, all right, I may not feel so good about all of used car sales, but I feel good about that guy. And that's the idea. We can, in fact, overcome that. And in fact, I think we must overcome that in order to give our customer everything that they need. Fantastic conversation with Professor Capra, and it gives us some good instruction as to how to build that trust, and all in the best interest of our customer. Well, that's a wrap on today's edition of The Buyer's Mind. We hope that you've subscribed to the podcast. That really means a lot to us. If you want to put a link on your social media page, I can't thank you enough for doing that. And as we wrap it up, just remember the quote from George MacDonald: "To be trusted is a greater compliment than being loved." There you have it, The Buyer's Mind. Hope you enjoyed it. You can find everything you need at jeffshore.com. But until next time, go out there and change someone's world.